Good morning, everyone, and welcome to StackVision's OPC Data Mapper presentation. I'm Reagan Sokolowski, a marketing specialist at ESC Spectrum, and today Simone Arends, System Implementation Engineer, is going to give you a general overview of the OPC Data Mapper interface. I ask that everybody hold their questions until the end, and then Simone will be able to answer any questions you may have after the presentation is over. With that being said, go ahead and get started, Simone.
Thanks, Anna. As Anna said, I'm Simone Arends, and welcome to this webinar. I hope you guys learn a little something today. I'll be talking about StackVision's OPC Data Mapper and data rules, which is a spreadsheet and a SQL database that we can use with OPC Data Mapper. Okay, so I like to start with acronyms when it comes to learning new stuff because there's so many acronyms out there. We need to know what they mean. And so what is OPC? Open Platform for Communications. And it's a common language to connect vendors with different networks and or devices. And it's an open standard developed and maintained by the OPC Foundation. You're going to constantly get updates for this kind of thing, or you can stay in constant communication with the OPC Foundation and whatever software they have, and keep that software up to date. Another acronym you're going to see often in this presentation is UA, and that will be attached to OPC. And so what is OPC UA? Well, UA stands for Unified Architecture. And StackVision OPC UA provides server client connections using TCP/IP communications protocol. StackVision OPC UA works together with the StackVision OPC Data Mapper or an OPC UA client, such as UA Expert. And that's a third-party client, and we'll briefly talk about that later. And well, what is OPC Data Mapper? Well, in short, it allows you to concentrate data easily from multiple OPC UA servers and disparate systems, devices, and machines that use any of the following OPC servers. And I've got Kepware or our example, OPC UA. These are different ways you can access data, different clients. And the OPC Data Mapper reads those OPC items from a source OPC server for mapping to a StackVision parameter. So that optional UA Expert that I mentioned, well, it's designed as it's the general purpose test client supporting OPC UA features such as data access, alarms and conditions, historical access, and calling of UA methods. You can access it via this URL, which you will have access to after this webinar. And this client, at least how I use it in the field, it can work hand in hand with your OPC Data Mapper, kind of just cross-reference those data parameter mappings with UA Expert and make sure that that data is mapped correctly. I think it's a good checking software. And it also provides more details than OPC Data Mapper does. Well, what's a visual representation of what's going on with OPC UA? Well, there are two situations that could happen when you're utilizing StackVision UA. You can use StackVision as a UA client. In that case, you're requesting data from a third-party server, and that server would then send data back to the StackVision UA client. You can also act as the server itself. StackVision UA server can house the data, and you can use a third-party client to request data from the StackVision UA server, and that UA server can receive that data. When StackVision is used as an OPC UA server, there's an application that's actually intended for third-party OPC UA clients that could exist on other servers, such as UA Expert, and you can check to see if it's requesting data from the StackVision server. for use by another OPC UA device, such as OSI, a Pi historian. I probably come across that more often as just Pi historians would send data to an OPC UA server. The OPC UA will come with a client certificate, and I'm mentioning it here because it could be a gotcha type of thing where you need to be aware that it exists and where it comes from. The OPC UA client certificate provided in the StackVision's installation is used for secure connections. So creating that self-signed certificate may be needed only if your organization has required their own server-side certificate instead of the one that's automatically provided by the StackVision installation. That certificate is automatically generated via the StackVision installation, and the location of it is provided on this directory. This directory is wherever StackVision is installed. It can be installed either in the C or the D drive. And that D drive would be StackVision, application, server, and then OPC. I'll have that written out in another slide. A typical installation stores those OPC trusted or rejected folders in this directory. Again, it just depends on where you store StackVision or where you install StackVision, but this is an idea of where you could find those certificates, whether trusted or rejected. Now about that installation, it's actually part of the StackVision installer. So if you already have StackVision, you can just rerun whatever version installer that you have. And if you're installing it for the first time, you would be selecting the ESC OPC UA services checkbox and then continue through the entire installation. This is only available for StackVision version 6.0 and greater. It should, once you've installed it, it should pop up under the StackVision folder. And as a brief demonstration, I'm going to open it up. This is what it looks like when the OPC Data Mapper is open. So there are a lot of things in the screen. What you may not see right off the bat as number 3 is the OPC Explorer. The reason that is the case is because I haven't connected to any type of UA server, such as a KEP server, which is shown in the screenshot here. The KEP server, I know it's a KEP server because in the number 1, the discovery URL, that's the URL that you're going to use to connect to a server elsewhere. The endpoints is you have a drop down because that discovery URL is just going to point to the server, and the endpoints is the actual specific URL that you're going to be using. And most of the time when I use this, you're going to be selecting the none option, which looks like, here's the discovery URL. Allow me to start the simulation software. This is acting as a UA simulation server elsewhere. If I wanted, I could treat this server that I have here as the UA server, but for our purposes and for simplicity's sake, I'm keeping this server acting like I'm pulling data from a different server on the same network. So if you know your discovery URL, that just depends on your network administrator. The dropdown for endpoints is going to give you several different types of endpoints, and the one that you're going to be using is your none. Once you hit connect, the OPC Explorer pane, which is number 3, will pop up. Parameters and expected values is in screen is the portion of the screen number 4. That reflects what is configured in StackVision. And then OPC tag mapping is the portion where you're going to be mapping StackVision parameters to the OPC Explorer pane or whatever you're connected to. Keep in mind that the definitions, at least my definitions of these terms, 1 through 5, you can actually find our definitions on our website, on our help page. So if I'm going to be giving you a lot of information today. So if it seems like I've given you information that wasn't on the page, it's probably true. But at the same time, you should be able to find a lot of the information I'm giving you on our website. Okay, so the OPC tag mapping field, number 5, has editable fields and read-only fields. We're going to talk about some of those notable editable fields. You have the map to field. That's the pretty important one. That's the field that you're going to actually have the StackVision parameter mapped to the OPC UA server. True value and false value, I'm going to use those in our examples today, but they're totally, it just depends on how you're going to be using that data. If you're expecting data to come in at a certain value, then you can use that to give a logic-based value. If it's greater than a certain number, then you can give the resultant value a number 1 or a number 2, for example. And then the same is true for false. If it's not that value, then you can give it a whatever number that you want. The time interval is just a drop-down list of time intervals that StackVision uses. So keep in mind that's whatever StackVision has configured. You can use this field to select whatever time interval that you're going to be using in StackVision that you want this data moved to in StackVision. You're going to be seeing 1-minute data in our examples, in our demonstrations. The rolling average option just determines if the StackVision parameter data displays a rolling or a block average. The scan interval refers to how often StackVision scans a mapped OPC server data item. You can use that drop-down list and select whatever scan interval for an OPC server data item. The most used fields is probably more of the most used fields is your scan type. This option just tells you what kind of time interval you're going to be scanning for. So for seconds, you would have the S type in there, M for minutes, H for hours, so on and so forth. So if your scan interval is set to just an integer of 30, and you have your scan type of S, it'll look back every 30 seconds. Generally, what I see most in the field is you're going to be looking for that scan interval to be in seconds, something less than a minute. The offset is the number of complete storage intervals you want to use to adjust the current time. So for example, if you are mapping 1-minute data and you have, then you are going back 1 minute to the most recent full minute. As it says here in the slide, the default is -1. This means go back 1 complete interval from now. So if you put in 2, it'd be 2 complete intervals from now. So that's a brief overview of the OPC data mapping fields. these fields can be exported and imported using Excel. The Excel uses a .csv file to edit these files that you export from or import into the OPC Data Mapper. That export won't have anything in it if there's nothing mapped to it. So briefly talking about how to map parameters, it's really straightforward. So hopefully it's something we can, that should be pretty easy to understand. You're gonna expand the OPC Explorer drop downs. Depends on what the server is giving you as options. You can select one of those OPC items and then click, hold, drag into the parameter mappings space. There's also an expected values tab that's adjacent to the parameters tab. If you select that tab, you can expand the folder that shows calibration sequences and their calibration parameters that are affected by those calibrations, and you can adjust those expected values. Find the OPC item that you're interested in, click, drag it into your average to whatever parameter you're looking for. Then you're gonna see the OPC tag mapping populate on the bottom of the screen. That row is gonna have an asterisk next to it. You could run into situations where you see that red exclamation point or the white exclamation point with the red stop sign around it. That just means that you have a duplicate mapping. The delete option in the OPC tag mapping space means that you'll be deleting the row. So if you click on the row and you hit delete, you should be able to remove that red warning icon for the duplicate mapping you need to remove. The only way that asterisk is going to be removed is if you save the server. And save the server is the option here. If you can see my cursor on the right side of the screen. So just as an example, I'm going to click, hold, drag into a parameter space. You should see the new option appear below. Hit save to server. You're going to hit yes because you are sure you want to save that OPC tag. And it'll give you a pop-up to say OPC tag mappings have saved successfully to server. Note that when you see this success, the OPC Data Mapper service will automatically restart. That's foreshadowing to some of our troubleshooting tips that we're going to talk about at the end of the presentation. So the map to field option is typically a data value, but it can be other things. You just have to make sure that the server that you're working with has the capability of sending these either numbers or strings that can represent the OPC Data Mapper map to field options. So this is just a list. There are more options, but you can find those options on our website. And we're going to primarily work with controller flag strings, which is on the bottom, row 18, and data values. The StackVision Data Lab field just represents the column name that you can, when you load our feature Data Lab, you should see that column value when you load data at first. And then the Data Lab fields below value are the options that you can load to see more information about that data point. And those data points can all be filled via OPC Data Mapper. Reference value mapping is the channel's expected values that can be mapped in a calibration sequence, in a calibration sequences phase. And each parameter listed is a new discrete OPC tag that can be mapped to a tag, and a tag is available for each parameter that is calibrated in each phase of the calibration. But just be aware that when you export or import a .csv file, it does not, these reference values don't make it into that export. It's a known issue that we hopefully will have fixed in our upcoming releases, but there's no firm determination on that. The expected value tab provides you and allows mapping directly to a configuration field, and the tag is available for each parameter that is calibrated in each phase of the calibration. Tag only supports a numeric data value. The expected value updates in Stack Studio only when the value changes. So once you have everything mapped, like I demonstrated earlier, you're going to click Save to Server. When you save to server, the OPC Data Manager service will automatically restart. Then as a good practice, it's good to export those configurations into a .csv file. The OPC Data Mapper provides an alternative method, which is working with Excel. So when you're working with that .csv file, you can treat it, you can work on a separate machine that has Excel, save it as a .csv file, and bring that .csv file back onto the machine and import it as a .csv file. When you import a .csv file, it overwrites the existing mapping configuration. One of the most common issues that I run into when we're troubleshooting the OPC Data Manager OPC Data Mapper is the OPC Data Manager service does not want to start. Occasionally, it might behoove you to stop and restart that service by stopping and starting it. And the StackVision Services Helper gives you that option to stop and start the OPC Data Manager service. I would recommend it as a first step whenever you're running into problems such as data not flowing to the StackVision server or data not flowing at all. Then, if you've done that step, but you still have an existing issue, we have log files that you can refer to. And they're designed to automatically generate log files for certain aspects of this feature. And I've provided the location of that. These timestamp logs provide information for events related to the StackVision server, acting as an OPC UA server. So this type of log file that you see here, datamapper.date.log, it's a date stamped log file, and it provides information for errors that occurred in the StackVision OPC Data Mapper application. And there's a different log file that can have different levels of debugging enabled, but you have to enable that by opening the .config file that's associated with these log files, and its location is provided there. And just as a thing to be careful of when you're editing this file, it's best practice to make a copy of it, save it elsewhere, and then edit the file as necessary. It's that .config file that you need to edit is an XML file, and you can use that config file to change the default settings of certain parameters. The config file does not, however, allow you to configure which data to log. It only allows you to change certain default settings. So those log levels is an example of those default settings. And by default, all logging will be output to what we call a rolling file. So it just appends elements to a separate file. And you can set a minimum or a maximum logging level to identify the range of logging output to this file. Optionally, you can also enable additional appenders in the config file. This would be useful to output specific logging levels to separate log files instead of a single combined log file. So our news feature is debug, which includes detailed information, typically used for troubleshooting purposes. 2 is default minimum logging level, including information on connections, services, starting and stopping, and other common actions without much data. And 3 warns, includes information noting that an item is invalid, typically configuration or data, but is unlikely to cause an invalid operation. And error, the default maximum logging level, including information on errors that occur and are likely to cause invalid operation. You can adjust this logging level in the .config file that I mentioned earlier in the log4net section of this file in the highlighted files shown here. The logging levels can be adjusted to have more or less info in the log file. So error is the max and info is the least. Okay. Moving on to data rules. What is data rules? Data rules operate similarly to condition manager, but a greatly simplified approach and runs a lot faster because it uses SQL directly to apply rules. Data rules are defined in rule sets. Rules are not associated with any particular parameter or interval. Since the rule sets are not inherently associated with parameters, you can define the interval and what parameters you want to apply with the rule set. And when while creating the data rules process now task. I'll show you how to do both in our examples. How do you open it? Well, you need to have some familiarity with SQL. So I'm going to briefly show you what that looks like, just in screenshots, and I'll open up our demo server to show you as well. So as the screenshot shows, you're going to drop down databases. Then you're going to find the StackVision database, drop that down, and you're going to look for data rules, which is this guy. The other tables that we're going to talk about today are your parameters list table, which is right above data rules rule. Then we're going to talk about something called the alarm notification config, which is this guy. We're going to talk about email, the email address list, which is a really simple one. Well, there's some more basics you need to know so you can work off of the SQL application. You can work on a .csv file, make those edits. You can actually copy and paste into the SQL database, but you need to know how to use some of these SQL basics to extract that file and use it as you want on a different machine or in a different application. So there's a lot of words on the screen, and just to demonstrate what that guy looks like. If you want to see everything in this that's in this space, you may not know how big this space is. So I'm going to go to Data Rules Rule, right click it, select top 1000 rows. The results will show up below here. And then I want you to right click in this space, and you can save the results as. You can also work directly in SQL if you have a simple edit to make. You can right click, edit top 200 rows to quickly get to this point. Here are all the rows in data rules, the data's rules table. You can make your edits. Note that you can copy and paste these rows too. If you have Excel open on the same machine, copy and pasting it. Just note when you do that, the null space is going to come along with it. I would remove them in your Excel or whatever application you're using. And then if you want to make an edit, copy and paste back in there. You don't have to worry about any weirdness that might come along with it. If 200 rows is not enough, or 1,000 rows is not enough, the properties of this query can be found in the right side of the SQL application and under the tree top specification. If the expression is 200, you can change that. So I'll change it to 2000. You'll notice that when I click off of that into a different space, query has changed. You'll right click, execute SQL. Okay, so what are the definitions of these rule sheets? Data rules rule applies rules. The parameter list is just a overall name of list and all of the parameters associated with that list. So basically groups, if you've ever used our new client tool, it works the same way. Groups, you can just name a group something and then have all its StackVision parameters with user-defined list names. It works in conjunction with data rules rule. And I'll show you what column uses the parameter list. Alarm notification config looks for specific StackVision exception, e.g. alarm name, and triggers emails. And whenever it triggers an email, the email address list is used. And it's analogous to the parameter list sheet, but for email lists. And it works in conjunction with the alarm notification config. And data rules rule and process now, there's not a lot you have to edit other than the other arguments field, which is shown adjacent to the all caps data rules. You can see my cursor. This isn't going to be filled in the, this is going to be defined in the other arguments field, and the brackets represent what's going to go inside them, is how you're going to define these things. So RS means rule set, so define the rule set found in the data rules rule table. And PL represents parameter list, which defines the group found in the parameters list table. This has to be set up in order for data rules to function, at least to its purpose. If you want to use data rules to initiate alarms, you're going to need to have this defined along with the dash R task, the dash R argument, excuse me. And I'll show you what that looks like. But the dash R argument is going to show you the actual StackVision alarm pop up in the active alarms panel. If you don't have that dash R argument, that at the end of the arguments field, then a StackVision alarm will not come up. But anything else defined in that data rules rule will still happen. You just won't have any emails triggered with it as well. So that's why the dash R is important. We're going to talk about examples that use that. The first example is it's supposed to represent a loggerless system. So how can I use data rules with OPC to check the status of fault bits and instruments? Well, it depends on a lot of things. One thing you need to be aware of is that you need to have direct communications with that analyzer with either the PI historian or via, it just depends on where that information is coming from, but you need to make sure it's mapped in the OPC Data Mapper field accordingly. You do that by configure flagging in OPC Data Mapper. Once you've configured the OPC Data Mapper, you're going to configure your data rules rule table entry. The following columns are going to be filled in this example: the data rule set, apply order, the controller flag is included, and the action alarm name. Note that it's not really necessary to have a parameter list in this example, and I'll show you why. Also configure the process now task and make sure that the rule set is correct. There's no typos in that set name, and use PL not used, and I'll show you what that means. That's just a way of not including the parameter list in the StackVision task and just including the parameter list in the data rule set. All right, so example one. Nope, don't care about updates. Okay, this is example one, which is rules rule ID 1. This guy has a rule set name of fault, representing our analyzer fault. And in StackVision or Stack Studio, the sequence data rules has the fault enabled task. Notice the rule set called fault. And notice the parameter list not used is included here. And then notice the dash R that I mentioned is included here. We need that in order for the StackVision alarm to populate. So I'm going to go back. Just want to connect the dots here. Here's a rule set name. Comments is completely optional, but it's definitely good practice. Apply order needs to be filled in. If there's only one rule, then it needs to be number 1. Override condition, source name, that just refers to the StackVision source. And then the override condition parameter. This is the guy, this source and parameter is the guy that we're looking for that has a flag coming in via OPC. And here the fault override, the fault list, this is the override action parameter list name. I put in fault here, but really what's happening in this data rule is that you're looking for this source and parameter to have the B flag. And when that B flag comes in, first of all, you're going to have that B flag filled in for this column. this column says controller flags include all of B flag. If it sees that B flag, it's going to raise this alarm, the action raise alarm name fault. So the parameter list is not used. It would only be used if we wanted to initiate that alarm or initiate some other value onto a different parameter that wasn't the parameter that we're monitoring for this rule set. So it's not necessary. I just included it in there so that we make sure we're connecting all the dots. So when we know when we see that fault name, that fault alarm come in StackVision, we know that the B flag is found on the data. So I have here, just as a simulation, that the OPC tag mapping space, I have a controller flag that's always going to show the B flag. I utilize the true and false value. So no matter what the value is coming from our simulation, it's going to be the B flag coming in. And let's see, it is 9:41. This is Data Lab. I'm retrieving 1 minute data. Here's the B flag coming in for source 01, parameter 03. I'm going to run process now. Process now is required to run the rule sets found in the data rules rule table. I'm going to run it over the most recent minute, which is going to be 0940 to 0942. Run that guy. And you're going to have this alarm, analyzer, and fault show up here. So this doesn't show you the name of the alarm or the exception. But if this description comes in, you kind of have an idea that the fault exception was triggered. And the fault exception is monitored by the alarm notification configuration table, which is this guy. And the alarm exception name that it's looking for, there are 3 options here, and one of them is fault. So if it sees that fault alarm come in, it's going to trigger the email address list name. Remember, that's analogous to the parameter list name, and it's going to trigger fault. Whatever emails are in this fault list, I'll open up the email address list. Whatever emails are here, you can find them in the addresses column. If you want to add more, add a comma. So it's going to send an email to this list name, and then in the alarm notification config, you can actually set the email subject line and body line. So for this example, SIMS fault occurred, and SIMS fault occurred on, now here's a couple different things. %S represents the source. %D represents the date. And both of those informations, both of those points are pulled from the alarm trigger. So this trigger email body space can be filled with whatever you want. The %P represents parameter. So that's how you monitor a flag, and you can monitor all of the different map to field options that we showed earlier in the presentation and give its own specific rule to it. Each rule is going to need its own row in the data rules rule table. And we're going to continue appending those rules, or they've already been appended, but as you add more rules, you're going to append them to the data rules rule table. So I just reviewed example 1B just to reinforce that information. After configuring the process now task, remember you need that -R enabled in order for the StackVision alarm to trigger, because that alarm notification configuration is looking for that exception name. Once that exception name is triggered, it's going to use the address list name and trigger the email subject and email body. One thing to be aware of is aggregate email true or false? I leave this true. I recommend leaving it true. That's in the event that you have multiple alarms in a row. Well, if you ever have that and you have an email triggering every hour, it's going to aggregate all of those emails into one, all of those alarms into one email instead of sending you emails for each alarm. Nobody wants endless emails, so I'd leave that on true. A good example is using a heartbeat parameter to monitor the communication with the OPC UA server and the StackVision server. This guy is, first, you configure your heartbeat parameter in the data mapper. Then you configure your data rule table. In this example, we have one to indicate that everything is good, and then we have another row that indicates everything is bad. And we'll be filling in these columns. I'm not going to read them out to you. And then we're going to configure our process now task as such. I have a note here. Remember that PL, we are going to be invalidating data if there is a communication loss. And in order to invalidate other parameters, we need that. We're going to utilize the parameter list. You don't have to put that parameter list in the data rules process now task, but you could. If you put it here, you have to make sure that it's consistent and or not filled in the data rules rule column, data rules rule row, that rule set that you're utilizing. Just make sure they're consistent. That's all I'm saying. All right. I'm going to open. I'm going to delete this guy. So this row here is a parameter that I have set aside for this example. I'm going to delete it to show that we've lost communication with that parameter. There are no asterisks in this example, but you have made a change, and you know you've made a change because the Save to Server button is now available to select. I'm going to click that guy once, hit yes, hit OK. All right, so that rule is looking for this guy. Source O2, condition parameter O2. I have a heartbeat parameter to kind of monitor that. Its default is 0, but whenever there's a communication loss, it's going to write a number 1 to it, and that's all going to be done in the data rules rule set. So the data is good is excluding any data that is just missing, and it's by default not going to be valid if the data is good, but if the data is bad, it's going to be missing and invalid. And whenever that happens, data is bad, we're going to raise an alarm. We're going to raise the default StackVision communications alarm. And when that is done, you're going to write a 1 to our heartbeat parameter. So let's see, data lab. retrieve. Here's the missing data for source 02, parm 02. So I'm going to run process now over those data points, which is 8 and 50. Which is going to give me this outstanding communication alarm. That's just to indicate that it's a standard StackVision alarm to show communication is lost between the StackVision server and the OPC UA server. You can have an email trigger sent out with this guy too. So you just follow the same exact process as example 2, as example 1B. I'm running out of time. All right. Next example. Capping data and changing data if there is a ceiling value associated with, in our example, O2 is a diluent. So the parameter reaches a point, a cap, and then once it surpasses that cap, we're going to write data to it via data rules. As an option, we're marking a reason code to indicate capping occurred. So whiz by this guy. Here is the rule. I set the OPC value at 20. And the OPC value is at 20, but the data rule is looking for the parameter O2, I'm sorry, the parameter source 03, parameter 03. It's looking for it to be greater than here, greater than 19.5. And when it does that, it's going to raise the alarm O2 cap. And it is going to set the value at 19.5. And I'm going to show you, first of all, the alarm. Here's the alarm. The value shows what it's been changed to, small note there, not what it was. And then data lab. Well, it should be 19.5. All right, well, we're out of time. That's the way it's designed. Let's get to questions.
All righty. Thank you, Simone. It looks like we've got a few questions here, and then anybody else can feel free to send them in because we'll just get through them all. The first question that we have is, can you tell us what some of the typical settings you use for most customers are? And I think that was sent in during the OPC tag mapping field slide.
Yes.
The notable editable fields.
The most notable editable map, so the map to fields or the OPC tag mapping? I'll go over both briefly.
Okay.
So for the StackVision mapping, I would say the controller string flags, which is the one we use in our examples, look monitoring analyzer flags, and then data values. Those are the most common. I've seen all of them used before, but that can be associated with, I mean, those are so flexible that you can use a data value and true and false value along with those map to fields. So you have a lot of options with data value and the controller flags.
All righty. The next one we have, it says, just to be clear, this is used to only get data out of StackVision, or is it used to get data into StackVision as well?
That's a great question. I tried to show that it's a specific scenario where you're pulling information from another server into the StackVision server, but the StackVision server can act as a OPC UA server and receive requests from another server to pull data from the StackVision server. So you have that option, but the most commonly way it's used, most common way I've seen it used is we're pulling information from another server. And the examples I've showed, I demonstrated pulling information from a simulation server.
All right, and then will you get an alarm or email for each individual minute, or will only one run until the alarm is cleared?
You'll get a StackVision alarm for each time that it has happened. And the email will not come in for each time it happens, because as long as you have the aggregate email option selected in the alarm notifications table, as long as that's set to true, then all of those 1 minute alarms will be consolidated into one email to show you how long that email happens. Also, caveat there, it depends on how often you run process now. The most typical way you do it is you run it every hour, and that every hour it's going to run data rules over the minutes of that hour. So I guess theoretically you can have one email to show you 59 or 60 alarms if there's a communication for that entire alarm, and you will get one email for that alarm. But StackVision, if it's a communication alarm for the 1 minute interval, you'll get 60 1 minute alarms. There is ways of reducing it to one.
Okay, I don't think I see any more questions. Great job today. Thank you, everybody. And this was recorded, so it will be up on our website later this week. Thank you so much, Simone.
You're very welcome. I hope everybody got a lot out of that, and I hope everybody has a great day.